Hello and welcome to Raider HQ After Dark. I'm your host, Raider. And in this video, we're going to be talking about service connecting fibromyalgia. So basically, we're going to be talking about what is fibromyalgia, what theories for service connection can be used, which ones are a little bit more advantageous than others, depending on the fact pattern of your evidence, kind of how the VA's M21 manual talks about fibromyalgia. Um, we're going to go into the MUCMI a little bit deeper, and we're also going to talk about how it's rated and go over the DBQ. So, kind of normal stuff that we do whenever we review for different theories for service connection. So, let me go ahead and share my screen. Now, I'm starting this off by kind of defining what fibromyalgia is, and I'm using the Mayo Clinic's definition. The reason why I'm using the Mayo Clinic is because the CMP examiners for the VA are often encouraged to use the Mayo Clinic as the gold standard for how conditions are reviewed. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at the Mayo Clinic's definition because that will kind of be the compass for the CMP examiners. So fibromyalgia is a long-term condition that involves widespread body pain. The pain happens along with fatigue. It can also involve issues with sleep, memory, mood. Researchers think fibromyalgia affects the way the brain and the spinal cord process pain and non painful signals. So they talk about this talks about the prevalence of it, like who gets it more than, women get it more than men. They can all, many people who have it also have these other conditions. Okay. Now, this is important because we'll go over this for like secondary conditions. So, just to start off, fibromyalgia can be a primary condition to which you can service connect other conditions too. It's also important to note that fibromyalgia is a chronic condition. Um, so, what are the symptoms? If you're kind of doing your own WebMD review to see if you might have this to talk about it to your doctor, then go to the Mayo Clinic, look up the symptoms here: widespread pain, fatigue, thinking related troubles. Now, the widespread pain, when we get into the DBQ, there's going to be specific, or the rating criteria, there's going to be specific criterion for this. So yeah, that's basically it for kind of, this is a nutshell review on what fibromyalgia is, because if I went through in detail, we'd be here for 4 hours. But I'll leave the Mayo Clinic's information in the video description. So, moving on. What is this? Please like and subscribe the video, and also click the notification bell and hype it if you want to, and do all that fun stuff. Awesome. What are the theories to grant that you can get fibromyalgia granted? So these are in kind of descending order as to which theories you should potentially seek out if you are claiming fibromyalgia. So the first one here is known as 38 CFR 3.317, or as it's more commonly known as a MUCMI. Fibromyalgia is a presumptive condition for if you served in a qualifying location that would that gives you that qualifies for this particular theory. This is the best one to lead off with if you have the qualifying service. So let me see here, which one's the qualifying service. So these are the qualifying service locations right here. It's 38 CFR 1117 also. There's a lot of these that kind of overlap with each other, but 38 CFR 3.317 falls under this same criteria. So if you served in any of these areas right here, and if you served in any of the airspace not included, so this could be the airspace above or the airspace above these locations, and you have to be boots on ground for this one, for these areas. But any of these areas count towards the location requirements for the 38 CFR 3.317 MUCMI. So if you have that, This is the theory to go with if you have that qualifying service. Now, let's say you don't have that qualifying service. What's the next best theory that you can use to grant? Well, if you were diagnosed with fibromyalgia within 1 year following your release from active duty, then the next best one is 38 CFR 3.309A, which is the chronic disability theory. So as long as you didn't have to have symptoms in service, you just had to be diagnosed with the condition within 1 year of your release from active duty, and it can technically be presumptive under this theory right here. Now, let's say that fact pattern also is not represent your specific situations of service. Then we come down here to direct, secondary, and Terra. The direct theory, you would have to show element 2 in service. So some kind of complaints in service that can be traced, that the condition can be traced back to. These ones down here are harder to actually get service connected unless you were directly diagnosed in service. If you were directly diagnosed in service, then the direct theory will probably be what you're given service connection for. Now, technically, and I'm using this because I don't know medically if it's possible, but technically, legally, fibromyalgia could technically be secondary to something else because there's nothing in the M21 manual that says it can't be. So, this fact pattern will have to be heavy in evidence. I mean, like, you will have to have all the evidence in the world and the most confident doctor in order to get this secondary to, fibromyalgia secondary to something else. And then the final one is similar to the MUCMI in that a chemical caused the fibromyalgia under TERA, toxic exposure risk activities. That's the theory, the brand new theory that was introduced with the PACT Act. So if you didn't have the qualifying location service, you might still potentially get it service connected due to certain chemical exposures. Now, once again, similar to the secondary, it's going to depend on number one, the chemicals that you were exposed to, and whether or not the CMP examiner believes that those particular chemicals could cause you to have fibromyalgia. So this is, I mean, could you have aggravation of a pre-existing condition? Technically, yes, but I've never seen it before. I mean, so technically aggravation could be a thing, but you would have to show how the military made it worse, and that's going to be the uppest hill battle you've ever had. So these are the theories that I kind of lean more towards that, these, if you can establish the evidence, mostly the element 2 evidence for each one of these theories, then technically they could be granted. So moving on. So all of these manual references will be in here, but when we're talking about how the VA reviews fibromyalgia, the criteria for evaluating fibromyalgia falls under DC code, diagnostic code 5025. Does not exclude the assignment of separate evaluations when disabilities are diagnosed secondary to fibromyalgia. So what does this mean? It means that fibromyalgia, if you can get it service connected, can become an anchor condition to secondaries. And there are quite a few. Now, these are so commonly known that they can be potentially secondary to fibromyalgia. Now, for depression and anxiety, they will have to be separate and distinct from any fibromyalgia symptoms themselves. So it would have to be like, chronic pain causes me to have depression type situation. And for the headaches, you can get headaches secondary to fibromyalgia, but the only way that you're going to get them like anything above 0% is if the fibromyalgia were to cause them to be prostrating. So go back to my videos about migraines and kind of look at the criteria that I use there for that. Because sometimes, yes, you can get headaches secondary to fibromyalgia, but it might be a 0%. And then irritable bowel syndrome. So this is one that everybody says can be secondary to fibromyalgia. However, sometimes the examiners are a little bit more resistant to this one. So, if this fact pattern matches up for you, then you're going to need, in my opinion, now this is just my opinion, you're going to need to bring a little bit more evidence for the irritable bowel secondary to the fibromyalgia. Uh, I don't know why the examiners are kind of leery about this one. They don't see a correlation between it, but the VA admits it, the Mayo Clinic admits it. Everybody admits that irritable bowel can be secondary to fibromyalgia. So, and if you've been denied, hang in there, keep going with it. Establish your evidence. If it's true, if that, unless you have some kind of alternative fact pattern that better explains why you have IBS, then I would just keep going with it and add evidence to it. Um, Sorry, Luna's moving around. If signs and symptoms are not sufficient to warrant a diagnosis of a separate condition, they are evaluated within the musculoskeletal pain and tender points under this. What does this mean right here? So, and this is kind of it's a mixed bag. It can be good and bad. So, if you have the actual diagnosis and not just symptoms, but you have a separate diagnosis, you can get them separately granted. However, if you just have the symptoms without an established diagnosis, then what they'll do is they'll say fibromyalgia with depression. They'll lock the symptom under fibromyalgia, which is not helpful whatsoever. So just keep in mind that um, that can happen and it's not a good thing. Now, how do you resolve that? Well, if you actually get a diagnosis rather than just the symptoms, if you get a separate diagnosis, then you can do potentially either a supplemental claim to disagree if the evidence was already there that you had a diagnosis, or in the future, if you have the diagnosis that you just get after, let's say, you get rated, then you can do an increase and say, look, I would like to separate these two out because now I have a diagnosis. So this, and I'm going to put this banner up here real quick, this is very important, that if you are somebody that has gotten fibromyalgia service connected and they combined the one of these separate things into fibromyalgia, there is a pathway to get it separated, separately granted, if the facts of your evidence line up with that. And the way that you would need to do that is, number one, get a separate diagnosis beyond just the symptoms of, say, depression, anxiety, headaches, or irritable bowel. And then once you get that, you can get, the coexisting then you can establish that they're coexisting separately diagnosed conditions, and that way they can be evaluated separately. The same signs and symptoms cannot be used to assign separate evaluations. So if this is just talking about 38 CFR 4.14 and 38 CFR 4.7, in that you can't use, like, if you have headaches that are attributed to your sinusitis, you can't use the headaches also in your fibromyalgia. So only one symptom can be attributed to one condition. So that's what 38 CFR 4.14 is. It prevents what we call pyramiding. And that's where you just use the same symptom in multiple places. Not too much to worry about in this. It's just letting you know that because it's a multi-symptom disease and it can have overlapping causes with other conditions. So typically what'll happen is the rater will pick the most, either the evidence will point them in a certain direction and they'll have to go that way. Or if the evidence doesn't and it's not so problematic that we have to send it back and have the examiner, weigh in one way or the other, then the rater will pick the most advantageous interpretation of 38 CFR 4.14 for you. So just keep that in mind. So we're just cooking right along here. Let's go ahead and let's talk about 38 CFR 3.317 MUCMIs. So if you are claiming under 3.317 for the undiagnosed illness and medically unexplained chronic multi-symptom illnesses, then this would be the most advantageous way. Now, there are certain requirements here that you have to be cognizant of, but if mainly what you need to have is you need to have either symptoms of it, but it's more preferable for fibromyalgia to have the diagnosis. Just because fibromyalgia is kind of a medical, a multi-symptom illness. So having the diagnosis helps you when you claim for under 3.317. As long as and I'm just telling you this just to tell you this, as long as there's no etiology or cause of the fibromyalgia. If you had, like, say, spinal surgery, and the spinal surgery is what caused you to have fibromyalgia, then that's what caused you to have fibromyalgia. So unless your spinal condition is the result of service, it's going to not be very compelling in order to grant. Now, under this 38 CFR 3.317 MUCMI grant, there are some additional criteria that the condition must have existed for 6 months or more. So if you just started having these symptoms, where you're having fibromyalgia symptoms, if you file a claim and you have not been able to report either subjectively or objectively that you've had the condition for longer than 6 months, then it can't be granted under this condition and most other conditions. The VA typically sees that a chronic disability has to persist for 6 months or longer. So just keep that in mind. And then mostly there's other signs or symptoms associated with this, which you don't have to worry about if you have the actual diagnosis of fibromyalgia. So I just kind of wanted to point this out and go over this again to just kind of tell you about the different, at least the 6 months of chronicity factor that is required, because it needs that 6 months to be considered a chronic disability. So, and then we talked about the qualifying locations for the 38 CFR 3.317, for the Persian Gulf War locations. These are them, and all these manual references will be in the description of the video. So if you want to, you can look them up, or I'll just leave them right here for a second for you guys to just take a look at. Just keep in mind, this is boots on ground and airspace above for the top one, but only boots on ground for like Turkey, Israel, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. Okay. So now that we've kind of talked about it, we've kind of gotten a little bit into what it is, fibromyalgia, and talked about it. Let's talk about how the VA rates it under diagnostic code 5025. Now, keep in mind that the VA also will consider and fibromyalgia syndrome primary. These are synonyms for fibromyalgia, so these are medical synonyms. Anytime that you see the term primary fibromyalgia syndrome, means that it can't be caused by anything else. It has to have like an unknown cause. So if you have it as primary fibromyalgia syndrome in your medical records, then you can't claim it secondary to something else, because it is its own thing. It's not due to something else. Please keep that distinction in mind. Now, the rating goes from 0% for just having the diagnosis and no compensable symptoms, up to 10% if your condition requires continuous medication to control. 20% when you have continuous medication for control and are episodic with exacerbations often precipitated by environmental or emotional stress or by exertion, but that are present more than 1/3 of the time. So this criteria, and we'll go through the actual DBQ for this. It's basically check boxes for all this stuff. So, and then we go to 40% that are constant or nearly so and refractory to therapy. Now, for all of these, the 10, the 20, the 40, you need with widespread musculoskeletal pain, tender points, with or without associated fatigue, sleep disturbances, stiffness, this word, headaches, irritable bowel syndrome, depression, anxiety, or Raynaud's symptoms. Blah, blah. I'm having a tough time today. Note. Now, this is where I talked about when we went back here and we talked about the widespread pain and whatnot. The VA has their own kind of definition about this. They narrow it down even further than the Mayo Clinic by saying widespread pain means pain in both the left and right sides of the body that is above and below the waist, and that affects both the axial skeleton, the cervical spine, anterior chest, thoracic spine, low back, and the extremities. So, in order to have the diagnosis be considered for VA purposes, it has to meet this criteria. If it doesn't, then the diagnosis doesn't meet the rating scheduler requirements. Um, and I should actually say this, with or without, and then it goes off into this stuff. So you don't necessarily need all these things. I should correct that, but yeah, the with or without. So you just need widespread pain, of the muscular skeletal pain and tender points, with or without, and then these things. So that's me clarifying a gaffe of mine. Now, what does the DBQ look like? Okay, well, let me make it bigger so that way we can all see it. So fibromyalgia gets its own DBQ benefits questionnaire. It it basically reads like everything else, like all the other DBQs, and that if you're doing a private DBQ or you're doing a VA examiner, the reason why we're going over this is if you're doing a private DBQ, I can show you what 10%, 20%, 40% look like. But I can also show you that for if you had like a VA examiner. So that way, if you review the DBQ, you can be like, wait a minute, I had all the criteria for 40%. Why didn't they mark it? So it just, forewarned is forearmed on this. So they would fill this out, truthfully, the examiner, either VA or non VA. They will report the evidence. Now, it is important that your evidence match up. If you have it to where they're like, oh, yeah, he's, had a car accident, now he's got fibromyalgia. Okay, then we're going to see that did the car accident cause the fibromyalgia? And was the car accident related to service? You need to make sure that your evidence makes sense on this. This is one of those conditions that you really want to make sure that the person doing your DBQ, that evidence matches up, lines up with the fact pattern of the actual evidence. So just keep that in mind. The dominant hand is important on this, or might be important on this, if you have secondaries that go off the fibromyalgia, like neurological ones. The diagnosis, so this is pretty easy. Does the veteran have a current diagnosis of fibromyalgia? And then it talks about the different types of fibromyalgia. So in order to be granted, you need to have yes here. This is where they get to qualify which one it is. Hopefully they're picking 1B right here, fibromyalgia. If they don't, like if it's one of these others right here, the fibrosis, then they could put it right here in the other section. IDC codes don't really matter. Now, the date of diagnosis does matter. And the reason why it would matter is potentially, depending on the fact pattern of your evidence, if you were in one of these new areas that were added with the PACT Act, if you were diagnosed before 8/10 of 2022, you could potentially get a year prior earlier effective date due to the liberalizing law change. It would require you to be diagnosed before 8/10 of 2022 and that you met the new location requirements. So that's just something to consider. If there's any additional diagnosis, this is important because this can start to lead to secondaries like depression, IBS, things like that. We want to know, like, this is important, especially if you're doing a private DBQ, to start pointing out those secondaries, right? Or if you had a VA examiner that filled this out, if they say that you have other diagnoses that pertain or caused by fibromyalgia, and they list it here, then that might have been a missed issue for the rater to say, hey, look, you should have done a DBQ on this so I can potentially rate it secondary to the fibromyalgia. Now, similar to the section above, medical history is going to be critical on this. Fact patterns matter. If your fibromyalgia is due to something else, or if your fibromyalgia is not due to something else, and this information isn't accurate, you need to review it, or vice versa. Like, you need to make sure that your medical history is accurate to your medical history. I mean, it just makes sense. This is what a lot of raters utilize in order to find conflicting evidence within your particular rating decision. If it shows that you had some kind of procedure and that procedure could have potentially caused your fibromyalgia, then we'll want to have that be discussed by the examiner before we rate your condition, even if they gave a positive medical opinion, because that granting might have been premature. And sometimes I know you guys get mad at the raters, but they have to do this. This is like that's part of their job, is to make sure that there is no doubt that A caused B. Like there can't be any doubt. So, and that's another reason why I have that perception that I do, that a 51%, that's the kind of criteria that I like to see, because if there's any potential doubt, I can't, the tie doesn't go to the veteran. The doubt must be resolved. So, anyway, so let's go back here to the part 4 and let's talk about what does it take to get 10%. Well, on the DBQ, question 2B, is continuous medication required to control the fibromyalgia symptoms? Yes. If question 2B is marked yes, then you meet the criteria for 10% under the fibromyalgia if granted. Now, let's move down. Is it currently undergoing treatment? Not necessarily the most important question, right? Because treatment isn't actually reported as being needed here, except for the refractory therapy. But if they said no here, that wouldn't necessarily limit you to the 10% if they said no to 2C. Now, are the veteran signers refractory to therapy? Okay, so this question, 2D, that comes back to the 40%. This is what I don't like about the DBQs. Okay, I don't understand why the DBQs do this. They go out of order. What I wish that they would do, and if anybody wants to advocate that, is that the questions go in a descending order that actually go with the ascending criteria. Why do I have to look back and forth? If you make a rater look back and forth and all around for different symptoms, the likelihood for them, and I understand it's their job, they should do it anyway, but it does increase the likelihood that the rater's going to miss something, right? Because fibromyalgia is not rated that often. So let's say they say yes here. Now, it's even out of the findings and signs and symptoms. So it's easy for raters to miss this. It's their job to catch it, but it's easy for them to miss it. So I'm not making excuses for them. I'm just telling you how sometimes this is why you need to review this form, I guess is what I'm telling you. Now, does the veteran have currently any signs or symptoms? Now, what's weird is this question right here is for the 40%. So refractory to therapy, refractory to therapy. Then we talk about all the symptoms. So this right here, widespread muscular pain, that is this right here. So you don't need it. I mean, I guess you do need it, this part. So you need this in order to get fibromyalgia. You need with widespread muscular skeletal pain and tender points. So this question has to be checked yes in order to get you, any kind of, rating decision, I would say. Now, these are not necessarily required to be checked, as evidenced by the fact that these are with or without all of these things. So they're not required to be checked, but they can be. They don't really help anything other than to potentially get you a secondary for it, to allude that there might be a secondary for it, like for IBS or Raynaud's or whatever. Now, if we come down here to the frequency of fibromyalgia symptoms in 3B, this is where a lot of the heavy lifting on deciding what you're going to be rated under, how that's going to be. So we've already talked about the 40%, this part. Then the symptoms need to be constant or nearly so, and refractory therapy. So that refractory therapy has to be checkmarked yes for the 40%, but the near constant this is where you see the near constant. So in order for the 40% to be qualified, in order for the rater to give you 40%, question 3B right here has to be checked yes, but also this question in 2D must be checked yes. It's maddening from the rater's perspective, because a lot of DBQs do this. So that's how you get 40%. So 2D and 3B are the two questions that need to be marked specifically this way in order to get the 40% for fibromyalgia. Now, we've got episodic with exacerbations and overexertion and all this stuff. We've already finished the 10%, so that one's out. So what does it take to be 20%? So for 20%, episodic with exacerbations, right? Episodic with exacerbations precipitated by environmental or emotional stress or exertion. So if we come back here, this box also has to be checked. Precipitated by emotional and stress or overexertion. Then it also talks about this last one, present more than 1/3 of the time. So in order to get 20% for fibromyalgia, you have to have question 3B, all three of these checked, versus the 40% that requires you to have this box checked and this box checked, yes. And they have to describe it. So the 40%, it has to be marked yes, and they have to describe what the refractory therapy is. So we're not gonna take the doctor at their word. They've got to describe the symptom refractory to therapy. Refractory to therapy. I don't know why I'm saying refractory therapy, but anyway, you guys get what I mean. But the rater's not going to pick apart too much what these symptoms look like, as long as they say something here. They have to say something. If they don't say something, then they have to describe it. If they don't, then we'll send it back. But that's about it for what it takes to get to the 10%, the 20%, the 40% for fibromyalgia. I've done my best with this. Fibromyalgia, I shouldn't say that. I've granted like maybe 4 people with fibromyalgia. It's very uncommon, at least for me. This question right here for the tender points, they just need something marked. It doesn't matter. Like there's no real requirement here other than they have tender points. Does the veteran have any other pertinent physical findings, complications, conditions? Sure. I mean, not required for the fibromyalgia. Sometimes you can have scars. If so, like if you did have scars, we would rate them secondary. So they wouldn't, this would be an additional claim. It wouldn't help your fibromyalgia any, but it would be a secondary claim. And if they're disfiguring, they have the chance to be 10% or higher. Diagnostic tests. I mean, honestly, there's no requirement in the 38 CFR or the M21 manual for any diagnostic tests to be done for fibromyalgia, but they can help with getting a diagnosis of it. But if you already have a diagnosis of it, then it's not required. The employment function status thing doesn't work the way anybody thinks. By checking yes here, we do not have to pursue IU at all. It's not evidence of evidence. You would have to say certain specific things in order to have IU inferred by the rater. I wish some attorneys would stop with this, because this is like my pet peeve is like attorneys will be like, you didn't follow through with this. Well, we don't have to. So, you know, I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry. It's not the way the M21 tells us to. Does the veteran have any assistive devices? Not relevant to the fibromyalgia at all. Doesn't get you anywhere. There's no ancillary benefit for that or anything. This remarks section is also going to be highly scrutinized by the rater. So the remarks have to make sense. If you're like, if they say something that contradicts something else in the that they checked the box for, like he has intermittent symptoms, but they check the box for constant, we're obligated to go back and get that clarified. You know, like, can you please, which one is it? It can't be both. It's either near constant or it's not. Once again, this is not such a problem for the VA examiners, but for the private examiners, they have to fill all of this out. Their NPI number has to match what the National Provider Index site says, because we're going to look it up and make sure that they are who they say they are. Same thing with the medical license number. Less important on the medical license number. It has to be there, but the National Provider Index number is the one that is often used to provide, credibility and authenticity of the private DBQ. Same thing with that. The National Provider Index website, their address, their phone number, their fax number, their, all that stuff has to match what's on the National Provider Index, or else the VSR and the rater are going to toss the DBQ and or medical opinion. Just because it's not, at that point in time, there's grounds for inauthenticity, because we can't verify that person's, that they are who they say they are. But one last thing here, we also want to make sure that we're using a semi-updated DBQ if possible. Let me go up here to the top. They don't typically have an expiration date on them, but you just want to make sure that you're getting your DBQs from the va.gov website, because that's the most up-to-date version. Like if the VA changes some part of the manual to where how they interpret things, or they change the DBQ itself, the va.gov sites are the best place to go to this. So don't go anywhere else. That's about all I got for you on this one. Let me just take the time to thank all of the subscribers, everybody that's watching the channel. I appreciate it. I'm going to keep doing videos like this for you guys. I hope you like it. I know this one, I made a gaffe there with what I said, but honestly, fibromyalgia is kind of a weird bird. So just understand that if you file a claim for something that is not common, the likelihood of them not having experience adjudicating that type of claim, or missing something when it comes to the DBQ or evidence, is higher. So anytime you're doing something that is not a common disability, you're claiming something that's not a common disability, make sure, like, it behooves you to make sure that your evidence is more organized than normal, that it is more like that you do your research, so that way you can double, triple check, confirm that, nah, I have it right here, in case, like, let's say that the rater they don't fully adjudicate your claim, effective date, rating decision, whatever, and you need to do a higher level review. You want to make sure that evidence is there for the DRO to have access to, so that way they don't have to look hard for it, and they don't get bored and look at anything else. But anyway, guys, once again, thank you for, watching, listening, doing all the fun things. So if you can, like and subscribe if you're not liked and subscribed already. It does help the channel. I appreciate it. But anyway, Raider out.